Welcome to the Eclectic. Some cases do not resolve into answers. They accumulate detail instead, and in doing so, they leave behind something heavier than explanation. This is one of those cases. In the summer of 1629, on a remote chain of coral islands off the western coast of Australia, civilization seemed to disappear. There were no cities, no laws, no authority, no escape. Only a scattering of survivors stranded on barren fragments of land surrounded by the vast emptiness of the Indian Ocean. Within weeks, ordinary people would be transformed into victims, executioners, rapists, rebels, and murderers. Men would slit the throats of sleeping children. Women would be seized as sexual slaves. Entire groups of castaways would be hunted down and exterminated. By the time rescue finally arrived, the survivors would be living among mass graves. The story of the Batavia is often described as one of the worst disasters in maritime history, but the shipwreck itself was only the beginning. The true horror started after the survivors reached land. This is the story of how a Dutch trading vessel carrying merchants, sailors, soldiers, women and children descended into one of the bloodiest mutinies ever recorded, and how a tiny coral atoll became a kingdom of terror. To understand what happened in the Hultman Albrahos in 1629, we first need to understand the world that created the Batavia. The 17th century was the age of empire. European powers were locked in fierce competition for wealth, influence, and control of global trade routes. Fortunes could be made from spices alone. Nutmeg, cloves, pepper, and cinnamon were worth astonishing sums in Europe, and the nations that controlled their supply could become immensely rich. No organisation embodied this new age better than the Dutch East India Company. Known by its Dutch initials of the VOC, the company was more than a commercial enterprise. It possessed powers usually associated with governments. It could wage war, establish colonies, negotiate treaties, maintain armies, and command fleets. By the 1620s, it had become one of the most powerful corporations the world had ever seen. Every year, fleets of heavily armed merchant ships sailed from the Netherlands to Asia, carrying silver, trade goods, and personnel. They would return months later, loaded with spices and exotic commodities destined for European markets. The profits were immense. The risks were equally immense. Ships vanished in storms. Disease swept through cramped quarters. Mutiny, well, that was a constant fear, and navigational errors could prove fatal. Into this world sailed the Batavia. Built in Amsterdam and launched in 1628, she is one of the Dutch East India Company's newest vessels. At around 56 metres long and weighing approximately 650 tons, she was a substantial ship by the standards of her age. She was intended to be a flagship, strong, impressive, profitable. The Batavia represented the confidence of a company at the height of its power. When preparations began for her maiden voyage, her holds were loaded with valuable cargo. Chests filled with silver coins were intended for purchasing spices and other goods in Asia. Luxury trade items were packed aboard. Officials, merchants, soldiers, and sailors crowded her decks. There were also women and children among the passengers, families seeking new lives, people chasing opportunity, people hoping for wealth, people who could never have imagined what awaited them. Contemporary records differ slightly on the exact number aboard, but historians generally place the figure between 330 and 341 souls. Most would never return home. The man placed in overall command of the voyage was Francisco Pelseaert, an experienced senior merchant in the Dutch East India Company. Pelseaert was entrusted with overseeing the vessel and its valuable cargo. Yet from the beginning, there were tensions aboard. The ship's skipper was Ariane Jacobitz. The relationship between the two men was poor. Years earlier, they had served together in the Dutch trading world of Asia, where a public confrontation had left lasting bitterness. According to historical accounts, Pelseaert had openly humiliated Jacobs after an incident involving drunkenness and insubordination. Neither man had forgotten. Now they were trapped together aboard a ship that would spend months at sea. In the rigid hierarchy of a VOC vessel, such personal hostility was dangerous. But there was another passenger whose presence could prove even more consequential. His name was Geronimus Cornelius, and he would become one of the most infamous figures in maritime history. Cornelius was not a sailor. He was not a soldier. He was an educated man, a former apothecary, a merchant, someone who, on paper at least, appeared respectable. Yet his life began to unravel. Business failures had left him in financial difficulty. His connections to controversial religious circles had drawn suspicion. Some accounts suggest he feared arrest in the Netherlands. The voyage aboard the Batavia, well, that offered an escape route, a fresh start, a chance to leave old problems behind. Instead, it would immortalize his name for all the wrong reasons. According to the testimony later gathered by investigators, Cornelius became closely associated with Jacobs during the voyage. Both men allegedly developed a common grievance against Pelseart. Both men possessed ambition, and both men appeared to have recognized an extraordinary opportunity. The Batavia? Well, it was carrying a fortune protected only by the authority of a command structure that could potentially be overthrown. Evidence gathered after the disaster suggested that a mutiny may already have been forming long before the ship reached Australia. Whether every detail of the alleged conspiracy is true remains debated by historians, but contemporary records indicate that Cornelius and Jacobs were believed to be involved in plans to seize control of the vessel. If successful, they could take possession of the ship, its treasure, and its cargo. The rewards would be enormous, but first, they needed support, and support required chaos. As the Batavia pushed deeper into the Indian Ocean, tensions aboard the vessel grew. Months at sea had been difficult, food deteriorated, and fresh water became scarce. Tempers flared. The rigid social divisions of 17th century life became even more pronounced in the confined environment of a ship. Then came an incident that would later assume enormous significance. A wealthy and well-connected passenger named Lucretia van der Meulen became the victim of a violent sexual assault. Accounts vary in detail, but contemporary investigations concluded that members of a group associated with the alleged mutiny were involved. The attack appears to have been intended as a provocation. The conspirators hoped Pelseart would react harshly. If discipline seemed excessive, they could portray him as a tyrant and recruit disaffected crewmen in their cause. It was a calculated attempt to manufacture conflict. But the plan failed. Lucretia could not identify all those responsible. The incident created tension, but not the widespread rebellion the plotters had hoped for. The voyage continued. Yet, beneath the surface, distrust and resentment continued to simmer. No one realized that events far beyond anyone's control were already moving toward catastrophe. The Dutch East India Company relied upon a navigational strategy known as the Brouwer route. Rather than hugging coastlines, ships sailed eastward across the southern Indian Ocean before turning north toward the Dutch East Indies. The route saved time, but it carried a deadly flaw. Longitude could not yet be measured accurately at sea. Captains knew roughly how far east they should travel before turning north, but knowing precisely when to make that turn, that was another matter entirely. Too early, and the voyage would be delayed. Turn too late, and disaster awaited. By the late spring of 1629, the Batavia was approaching the most dangerous phase of her journey. Unbeknownst to those aboard, the western coast of Australia lay ahead. Its reefs and islands remained largely unknown to Europeans. The charts of the period were incomplete, and mistakes could be fatal. In the darkness before dawn on the 4th of June 1629, those mistakes finally caught up with them. The Batavia slammed into Morning Reef. The impact was catastrophic. The collision tore through the vessel. Wood splintered, water surged into the hull, and panic erupted. Men stumbled from their bunks, passengers screamed, crew members rushed to assess the damage, but there was little they could do. The ship was trapped fast upon the reef. Waves hammered her relentlessly. Every impact weakened the structure further. As the hours passed, it became increasingly clear that the Batavia was doomed. Some people drowned during the initial chaos. Others died as sections of the vessel began to break apart. Historical estimates vary, but around 40 people are believed to have died immediately, with additional deaths occurring during the desperate attempts to reach safety. The survivors faced a terrifying choice: remain aboard a disintegrating ship, or trust themselves to small boats and makeshift rafts in an unfamiliar and hostile sea. One by one, they abandoned the wreck. Using the ship's longboat and yawl, survivors were ferried toward nearby islands. The destination was Beacon Island. At first glance, it appeared to offer salvation. Land, solid ground, a chance to survive. But appearances can be deceptive. The Houtman-Albrahos Islands were beautiful from a distance. Up close, they were a nightmare. Low-lying coral outcrops baked beneath the Australian sun. Sparse vegetation, little shelter, virtually no fresh water. Few reliable food sources. For hundreds of stranded survivors, they represented a prison rather than a refuge. The castaways quickly realized the seriousness of their situation. Even if they had escaped drowning, they might still die of thirst. Food stocks salvaged from the wreck were limited. Water, that was almost non-existent, and no rescue ship was expected. No one knew exactly where they were. The nearest major settlement lay thousands of kilometers away. Every day increased the likelihood of starvation, dehydration, and death. The situation demanded leadership, and leadership required decisions. Francisco Pelsealt faced an impossible choice. If fresh water could not be found locally, everyone would perish. There was only one realistic option. Someone had to go for help. The journey would be extraordinarily dangerous. Success was uncertain. Failure would almost certainly mean death. But without attempting it, the fate of the survivors was already sealed. Pelsealt made his decision. He would leave. Taking the longboat, he assembled a party that included senior officers, crewmen, passengers, and significantly, Aryan Jacobits. Almost everyone who could fit into the vessel insisted on joining. Those who remained behind watched as the overloaded boat disappeared into the vastness of the Indian Ocean. Many probably assumed they would never see it again. In truth, they had just witnessed the departure of the only authority capable of preventing what was about to happen. Because among the hundreds left behind on those barren islands stood a man who had been waiting for an opportunity. And now, with Pelsealt gone, Geronimus Cornelius finally had one. When Francisco Pelsealt's longboat disappeared beyond the horizon, the survivors of the Batavia were left with little more than hope. Hope that help would come. Hope that water would be found. Hope that somehow they would endure long enough to be rescued. What they did not know was that the greatest threat to their survival was no longer thirst, hunger, or the unforgiving Australian wilderness. It was each other. More specifically, it was one man, Geronimus Cornelius. At first glance, Cornelius hardly seemed the type to become a tyrant. He was a merchant and former apothecary, a man whose life had largely been spent among medicines, trade goods, and ledgers. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that authority often falls into the hands of those willing to seize it. And on the islands of the Houtman-Albrahos, there was suddenly a vacuum of power. Francisco Pelsealt was gone. Most senior officers had departed with him. The survivors were frightened, exhausted, and desperate. Cornelius moved quickly. Before anyone could challenge him, he positioned himself as the central authority among the castaways. His rank within the Dutch East India Company helped. Many survivors naturally looked to a senior company official for guidance. What they received instead was the beginning of a reign of terror. Control, Cornelius understood, depended upon resources: food, water, weapons. Whoever controlled those things controlled the survivors. One of his first actions was to gather the remaining stores under his authority. Weapons recovered from the wreck were confiscated. Food supplies were centralized. Access became dependent upon obedience. It was a simple strategy, but an effective one. The survivors had few options. Without food, they would starve. Without water, they would die. Cornelius made sure everyone understood who controlled both. But resources alone would not guarantee his position. There remained another problem: their soldiers. Among the survivors were trained fighting men. Unlike merchants, passengers, and sailors, soldiers possessed organization, discipline, and combat experience. If anyone could challenge Cornelius's authority, it was them. The most prominent among them was a soldier named Weeb Hayes. Hayes was not an aristocrat. He was not a high-ranking officer. He was simply a common soldier. Yet over the coming months, he would emerge as one of the most important figures in the entire story. Cornelius recognized the danger immediately. If he intended to dominate the islands, Hayes and the soldiers had to be removed. The solution appeared elegant. He ordered Hayes and approximately 20 other men to travel to the nearby West Wallaby Island and search for fresh water. They were instructed to signal if they found any. On the surface, it seemed entirely reasonable. Everyone needed water. Everyone knew that. But according to later testimony, Cornelius never expected them to return. The islands had already been searched. Fresh water appeared non-existent. By sending the soldiers away, he hoped to eliminate the only organized force capable of resisting him. The men departed. Cornelius watched them leave and believed he had solved his greatest problem. He was wrong. West Wallaby Island turned out to be far more hospitable than anyone realized. Against all expectations, Hayes and his men discovered fresh water. Not only that, they found food, birds, eggs, wallabies. For the first time since the wreck, a group of survivors possessed something approaching stability. Excited by their discovery, they sent the agreed smoke signals. The signals drifted into the sky, a promise of salvation, proof that survival was possible. Back on Beacon Island, Cornelius saw the smoke. For a brief moment, his plans began to unravel. The soldiers were alive. Worse still, they were surviving. By now, Cornelius had already begun reshaping life on Beacon Island. He established a council dominated by loyal followers. People who questioned him found themselves isolated. Those who supported him gained privileges. A small inner circle emerged. Together they controlled food, weapons, and access to information. Fear? Well, that became an increasingly powerful tool. Survivors understood that crossing Cornelius could have consequences, but few yet realized just how far he was prepared to go. That became apparent when the killings began. At first, the murders came gradually. A disappearance here, a suspicious death there. Someone sent away on an errand who never returned. Someone accused of theft. Someone considered troublesome. Someone considered unnecessary. The justifications varied. The result remained the same. They died. The murders were often carried out at night. Victims were attacked while sleeping, their throats cut before they could cry out. Others were beaten to death. Some were drowned. Others were abandoned in circumstances where survival, that was impossible. The killings served multiple purposes. They eliminated potential opposition, and they reduced the number of mouths to feed. And perhaps most importantly, they spread fear and terror. The survivors quickly learned that resistance could be fatal. What makes the Batavia massacre especially disturbing is how rapidly the violence escalated. Many historical atrocities emerge from long periods of political conflict or ideological hatred. The events on the island unfolded in a matter of weeks. People who had shared a voyage together suddenly found themselves divided into predators and prey. Cornelius rarely carried out the killings personally. Multiple contemporary accounts suggest he preferred to order others to do the work. This distance allowed him to maintain authority while avoiding direct involvement. He manipulated his followers. He rewarded loyalty. He normalized violence. Gradually, murder became routine. Witnesses later described a horrifying transformation. What began as survival killings evolved into something far, far darker. Some participants appeared to start killing simply because they could. The distinction between necessity and cruelty, that vanished. Among the most vulnerable were women and children. Families who had survived the wreck now found themselves trapped in a nightmare. Many women were murdered alongside husbands and relatives. Others faced a different fate. Several were spared specifically because Cornelius and his followers wanted them alive. They became sexual slaves. Among them was Lucretia van der Meulen. Months earlier, she'd been targeted during the alleged mutiny plot aboard the Batavia. Now she found herself trapped under the control of the same man who had helped orchestrate that conspiracy. Historical records describe her being forced into sexual servitude. She was not alone, though. Other women endured similar abuse. For them, rescue remained a distant dream. Every day brought new uncertainty. Every night brought fresh terror. The killings were expanded. The sick were targeted. The elderly were targeted. Children were targeted. Entire groups were sent away on makeshift rafts and deliberately abandoned. Others were lured into isolated locations and murdered. Some victims were forced to participate in killings themselves before eventually being killed. The atmosphere, that became one of absolute paranoia. Nobody knew who might disappear next. Nobody knew whom they could trust. Friends became informers, neighbours became executioners. The small island community descended into a state of permanent fear. Years later, witnesses would struggle to describe what they had experienced. The brutality seemed almost beyond comprehension, yet the evidence suggests it happened. Again and again, week after week, body after body. One of the most tragic accounts involves the family of a preacher named Batavia. Like many survivors, he had endured the shipwreck only to find himself trapped within Cornelius's emerging dictatorship. His wife and younger children would eventually be murdered during the massacres. Only one daughter survived, and that survival came at a terrible cost. She was reportedly seized and subjected to repeated sexual violence by members of the mutineer faction. The suffering endured by the families, such as the Bastioners, demonstrates that this was no longer merely a struggle for resources. Something much darker had taken hold. The island had become a place where cruelty flourished unchecked, where there were no courts, no laws, no police, no possibility of escape, only the authority of whoever held power. And at that moment, power belonged to Hieronymus Cornelius. As the weeks passed, the death toll climbed steadily. Modern estimates vary slightly, and historical sources are not always consistent. But most historians believe that somewhere between 110 and 125 people were murdered following the shipwreck. Men, women, children, infants. The scale of the slaughter is difficult to comprehend. The original disaster had already claimed dozens of lives. Now the survivors themselves were becoming the primary cause of death. By any measure, it was one of the worst episodes of mass murder in maritime history, and it still wasn't over. Because while Cornelius tightened his grip on Beacon Island, events elsewhere were moving in a direction he could never have anticipated. The soldiers he had condemned to death were still alive, more than alive. They were preparing to fight back. On West Wallaby Island, Weeb Hayes and his companions had begun receiving refugees. Terrified survivors escaped from Beacon Island whenever opportunities arose. Some arrived by raft, others swam dangerous stretches of ocean. All brought the same stories. Murder, disappearances, execution, rape, a growing reign of terror under Cornelius. At first the soldiers struggled to believe what they were hearing. The claims seemed impossible. How could fellow castaways descend into such barbarity so quickly? But the stories kept coming. Different witnesses, different details, the same horrifying picture. Eventually there could be no doubt. Something terrible was happening on Beacon Island. And sooner or later, Cornelius would come for them. Hayes understood this. If Cornelius truly intended to control the islands, he could never allow a rival group of armed survivors to remain beyond his reach. Conflict? That was inevitable. The only question was when. So Hayes and his men began preparing. They gathered resources. They strengthened defensive positions. They fashioned weapons from wreckage, stone and salvaged materials. Most remarkably, they constructed what is often described as Australia's earliest European defensive fortification. Built from limestone and coral blocks, it wasn't impressive by military standards, but it represented something crucial: resistance. For the first time since the wreck, Cornelius faced organised opposition, and soon the struggle for survival would become open warfare. By late September of 1629, the survivors of the Batavia were no longer merely castaways. They had become opposing armies. On one side stood Hieronymus Cornelius and the men who had spent the weeks terrorising the islands. On the other stood Wee Hayes and a growing coalition of soldiers, labourers, sailors, and refugees who had escaped the massacre. The wreckage of the Batavia transformed a remote coral archipelago into a battlefield. And somewhere beyond the horizon, Francisco Pelciard was still fighting his own battle, a desperate race against time to return before everyone was dead. The journey to Batavia had been extraordinary. When Pelciard left the wreck site, many believed he would never survive. The distance alone was staggering. Nearly 3,000 kilometres of open ocean, no modern navigation, limited provisions, and an overloaded longboat. Yet somehow, against overwhelming odds, the party survived. For 33 days they battled exhaustion, thirst, storms, and uncertainty. When they finally reached the Dutch East Indies, the achievement was almost miraculous, but there was little time for celebration. Pelciard knew hundreds of people remained stranded on islands that appeared incapable of sustaining life. Every day increased the likelihood of catastrophe. The Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies immediately authorised a rescue mission. Pelciard was placed aboard the Saldan and sent back towards the coast of Australia. What neither he nor anyone else in Batavia knew was that the disaster had already evolved into something far worse than shipwreck. By the time the Saldan turned south, dozens were already dead. By the time it approached the Albrahos Islands, the death toll would be measured in the hundreds. Back on the islands, Cornelius's position was becoming increasingly fragile. For weeks, fear had been enough. Fear had allowed him to dominate survivors. Fear had allowed him to eliminate rivals. Fear had allowed him to create a personal kingdom built on murder. But fear alone could not solve a growing problem. Wee Hayes. Every day Hayes remained alive represented a threat. The soldiers had water. They had food. Most importantly, they had discipline. The very qualities that Cornelius's faction lacked. The situation became even more dangerous when refugees continued arriving from Beacon Island. Each new arrival carried news of fresh murders. Each new arrival strengthened Hayes' numbers. Each new arrival, that weakened Cornelius's ability to control the narrative. The survivors on West Wallaby Island now knew exactly what they were facing, and they had no intention of surrendering. The first confrontations were small: scouting parties, probing attacks, attempts to test defences. Cornelius expected easy victories. After all, he still commanded a larger force. His followers possessed firearms recovered from the wreck. Many had already proven willing to kill. Yet numbers can be deceptive. Hayes' men possessed something far more valuable. They trusted one another. They were fighting for survival, and unlike their opponents, they were well fed. Fresh water and reliable food had transformed their situation. While Cornelius' followers struggled with dwindling resources, the defenders grew stronger. The difference became apparent during the first serious clash. Attack after attack failed. The soldiers held their ground. Improvised weapons proved surprisingly effective. Stones became projectiles. Salvaged materials became clubs and spears. Coral fortifications provided protection. Again and again, the mutineers found themselves repelled. For perhaps the first time since the wreck, Cornelius encountered something he could not easily manipulate: determined resistance. As setbacks mounted, desperation began influencing Cornelius's decisions. The authority he had, built through terror, depended on appearing invincible. Defeat threatened everything. If his followers lost confidence, the entire structure could collapse. So he decided upon a bold gamble. Rather than sending subordinates, he personally travelled to negotiate with Hayes. The exact details remain uncertain. Some accounts suggest he hoped to persuade the soldiers to join him. Others suggest he intended treachery. And whatever his plan, it failed spectacularly. Hayes seized the opportunity. Cornelius was captured. Suddenly, the architect of the massacres found himself a prisoner, bound and helpless. The man who had terrorized the islands for months was no longer in control. It should have ended there, but history is rarely that simple. Although Cornelius had been captured, many of his followers remained free. Leadership passed to other mutineers, including a soldier named Walter Luz, Unlike Cornelius, Lewis appears to have recognized that time was running out. The possibility of rescue increased with every passing day. If a ship appeared before Hayes was destroyed, everything would be lost. The attacks intensified. Some of the fiercest fighting of the entire episode now unfolded. The mutineers launched increasingly determined assaults against the defenders. Muskets were brought into play. Hayes's coral fortifications came under sustained pressure. For a time, it appeared the mutineers might succeed. The defenders were outnumbered, exhausted, running short of resources. The struggle balanced on a knife edge. Then fate intervened. On the horizon, sails appeared. At first, nobody knew what they represented. The defenders saw them. The mutineers saw them. Everyone understood their significance immediately. Rescue had finally arrived. The Seldam had returned. What followed was a race. Not a race for treasure, not a race for food, a race for credibility. The first group to reach Pelseard would shape the story. And in the 17th century, that could determine life or death. Hayes understood this better than anyone. If the mutineers reached the rescue ship first, they might portray themselves as victims. They might accuse Hayes of rebellion. They might escape justice entirely. The defenders moved quickly. Boats were launched, messages prepared. Every effort focused on reaching Pelseard before the mutineers could act. Fortunately for the survivors, Hayes won. When Hayes reached the Seldam, he delivered an account almost beyond belief. Mass murder, systematic executions, rape, slavery, a failed mutiny. Entire communities wiped out. At first, the allegations must have sounded impossible. Yet evidence soon followed. Prisoners, witnesses, physical signs of violence. The truth became undeniable. Pelseard acted immediately. Armed men were dispatched. The remaining mutineers were rounded up. Resistance collapsed. After months of terror, Cornelius's kingdom finally ended. And what happened next reflected the brutal realities of 17th century justice. There would be no lengthy appeals, no years of legal proceedings, no elaborate investigations. Pelseard conducted trials on the islands themselves. Witnesses were questioned and evidence gathered. Confessions obtained, judgments delivered. The process was swift. And the punishments, they were severe. For many survivors, they could not come quickly enough. The islands were filled with people who had lost spouses, children, parents, and friends. Entire families had been destroyed. The desire for justice was overwhelming. Cornelius stood at the centre of it all. The former apothecary who had arrived aboard the Batavia, seeking opportunity, he now faced the consequences of his actions. Witness after witness described the horrors committed under his authority, the murders, the rapes, the terror, the destruction of lives. Although Cornelius had often avoided personally carrying out the killings, few doubted his responsibility. Before execution, his hands were cut off. It was a punishment intended not only to inflict suffering, but to symbolize his crimes. Afterwards, he was hanged. Several of his closest followers met similar fates. The executions were carried out on nearby islands. Nearly 4 centuries later, archaeologists believe they may have identified evidence associated with those grim events. Iron fastenings discovered on Long Island have been interpreted by some researchers as possible remnants of the gallows site itself. If correct, it means traces of those executions may still survive in the landscape today. Not all punishments ended with death. 2 men judged less culpable received a different sentence, abandonment. They were marooned on mainland Australia, left with limited supplies, left to survive or perish alone. No reliable record of their ultimate fate exists. They disappeared into history. Yet they occupy a remarkable place in the story. They may have become the first Europeans to permanently inhabit the Australian continent, a strange footnote in an already extraordinary tale. For Francisco Pelseard, the ordeal was not over. The surviving passengers and crew were eventually transported onward to Batavia. Of the more than 300 people who had begun the voyage, only around 122 ultimately reached their destination. The exact figures vary slightly between sources, but the conclusion remains the same. The majority were dead. Some drowned, some succumbed to hardship, many were murdered. It was one of the greatest human disasters in the history of the Dutch East India Company, and one of the bloodiest episodes ever recorded following the shipwreck. In the years that followed, news of the Batavia spread throughout Europe. Pelsiar's journals were published, witness accounts circulated. Readers struggled to comprehend what had occurred. Shipwrecks were familiar, mutinies were familiar, but this combination of shipwreck, mass murder, sexual violence, civil war, and execution, well, it seemed almost unbelievable, but yet it had happened. The Batavia became a cautionary tale, a story about greed, authority, isolation, and the frightening speed with which human beings can abandon moral restraints. For centuries, however, the islands themselves remained largely silent. Wind swept across the coral, waves crashed against the reefs, the graves remained hidden. The wreck slowly disappeared beneath the sea. Time seemed to be erasing the evidence. Then, in the 20th century, the dead began speaking again. In 1963, the wreck of the Batavia was rediscovered. What followed was one of the most significant maritime archaeology projects ever undertaken in Australia. Divers recovered cannons, coins, ceramics, navigation instruments, weapons, personal possessions. More than 35,000 artifacts have since been linked to the wreck. The findings transformed understanding of the disaster. But the most haunting discoveries were not made underwater. They were made on land. Archaeologists working on Beacon Island uncovered graves, human remains, evidence of violent deaths, physical traces of the nightmare described in historical records. Over the decades, more burials emerged. Then came new discoveries in the 21st century. Researchers identified multiple graves and human remains likely linked directly to the events of 1629. Some burials appeared careful and respectful, perhaps dating to the chaotic days immediately after the wreck. Others reflected the darker chapter that followed, evidence of conflict, evidence of resistance, evidence that the islands still hold secrets. In recent years, archaeologists have reported the remains of at least a dozen victims, together with signs consistent with the struggle between mutineers and survivors. Nearly 400 years later, the story continues to evolve. The dead are still being found, the evidence is still being examined, and new discoveries continue to emerge from the sands of Beacon Island. Perhaps that is why the story of the Batavia remains so compelling. Not because it is a shipwreck story, not because it is a murder story, but because it is both. A disaster that revealed the extremes of human nature, the worst and the best. The cruelty of Geronimus Cornelius, the courage of Wiebe Hayes, and the determination of Francisco Pelsiart. The suffering of hundreds of innocent people trapped between them. On a chain of isolated islands off the coast of Australia, civilization collapsed. For a few terrible months, survival belonged not to the strongest, but to those willing to resist. And even now, beneath the coral sands and the relentless sun, the victims of the Batavia continue to tell their story. A story of shipwreck, a story of mutiny, a story of murder, and one of the darkest chapters in maritime history. If you found this story compelling, please follow, rate, and share the show. It helps others discover these deep dives into the stranger corners of history. And if you have a family legend of your own, half truth, half ghost story, I'd love to hear it. This has been The Eclectic. Stay curious, stay questioning, and as always, stay eclectic.